stuff. We're starting to get people coming in.
Yeah. We'll turn our video.
And then we've got David Southwood. Hi, Jim.
Evening.
Oh, there's David.
Evening.
Hello. Hi, David. Welcome along.
Evening, David.
Hi there.
How you doing? I like the backdrop.
My brother, the paintings by my younger brother.
Ah.
He did them for my 21st birthday,
Yeah.
which was 1 or 2 years ago. In fact, if you recognize what the paintings are, you can possibly deduce how old I am.
Is it Alan Shepard?
No, it's Ed White.
Ah.
It's the first American walk in space.
Oh, I thought that was Alan Shepard. He was the first American in space, wasn't he?
Alan Shepard was the first American in space.
Yeah.
This was the first American spacewalk. The Russians did it a few months before. But it was the point at which I think I realized the Americans were winning the race. But, you know, before that, it looked like the Russians were winning the race. Anyhow, my brother was at art college. I was at university. And I guess it was the cheapest thing he could do is to use the art college to present me with this as a 21st birthday present. There are actually 3 of them, and they hang together. They vary in size, with the astronaut going from big to small, so that they give you a sense of them floating. Anyway, my brother is still a painter. He's never found anything better to do. And so there you are.
You certainly got the spread in your family from arts to sciences then.
Well, I think I'm basically the error, because my father was also a painter.
Oh.
And my niece, my brother's daughter, is a sculptor. So I don't know what went wrong with me. Well, actually, I can tell you, my father married my mother, and my mother was a sort of mathematician. So I guess that's, I take after my mother, and my brother takes after his father. There you are.
Fabulous.
Well, it's nice to meet you, David, because I've only ever heard you as a name, because I'm Sally's husband. So hello.
Hello.
It's a shame we're not hosting you this weekend.
Yeah, it would have been a nice trip right across the country.
Yeah.
I still couldn't get it in my head. You were willing to come all the way over from Plymouth. It's a good journey, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. Anyhow, it's a very strange experience.
Yeah.
I've sat through a variety of different talks where I've been in the audience during this crisis. This is the first one I've given.
Really?
Although it's good practice, because next week, just about exactly 1 week from now, I'm doing the same thing for Bristol Astronomy Society. I'm the president of Bristol Astronomy Society. I come from the West Country. We try to hide that, but
I wouldn't know, yeah.
no, we wouldn't know, would we? No, I actually come from Devonshire, but anyhow, so every year, the only thing you do if you're president of Bristol Astronomical Society is give them a talk once a year. I'm sort of president for life. I don't get time off for good behavior, and anyhow, there you are.
Yeah, so David, I should say, I don't know if I told you when we met on Zoom earlier, but I'd like to just do a little bit of society admin, if that's okay, at the beginning.
Yes, of
So
course.
you expect that, don't you? And that will be round about, I think, 7:35, something like that. Because you want to give people 5 minutes to join. And so I'll just do the usual things, go through a few little points and the boring stuff, and I'll try and get that over quickly, because I'm sure they all want to.
Okay.
Tales of Mars. But just thought I'd get that out of the way so we're clear with that. But that will be as short as possible. Yeah, so we've got a few people in here now. What I will do now is I'll make you co-host. That way you can then share your screen. Obviously, we don't want you to do that just yet. We're all arriving. Did you find it okay to edit your talk?
Yeah, I probably missed something, so
Oh,
I can. Well, you probably don't have any Performing Rights Society cover, so that's the issue. So I generally have things where, you know, bits of music and things like that, and I'm never, you know, never really sure of the status. It's fine if you simply give a talk and that's it. You know, it's as long as I'm not paid. But since you want to record it, I think one has to be a little more careful. So I've been through the talk and tried to attribute all of the material that belongs to, you know, ESA or NASA or whatever. But also I've taken out 1 or 2 proprietary items. But I doubt there's much likelihood of being sued, but better safe than sorry.
yeah, very much the professional. I don't think I'd think of those little minutiae, but they can be very major minutiae, can't they, sometimes?
Well, I do, you know, I've given talks in lots of different environments, and, you know, I once gave a talk at the Albert Hall, and I said, well, what do I do? I've got music, you know, I'm using some Vivaldi, what do you, and they said, that's all right, we have a sort of global license, so we just need to know what the music is, and then you're covered. But most astronomy societies haven't thought of this one.
No,
You're all right
no,
with Vivaldi. He's been dead for a very long time.
that's the thing, yeah. If an artist has been dead 100 years...
Well, I think it's whoever's playing the violin that matters, not
yeah.
not who composed it.
Yeah, if you played it yourself, would that be different?
I think it'd be okay.
Yeah. No.
And in fact, actually, I use this backdrop with my brother's paintings. I've used that before it's obviously very attractive. I used it for a TV. I did something for a TV program about a week ago with Maggie Adderin, you know, the person who does Sky at Night.
Yeah.
She's an old student of mine. She was my personal tutee when she was at Imperial College. And she wanted me on this program, so I agreed, and I talked about the backdrop, and I said, well, you know, I've got these lovely pictures by my brother. And it then turned out we had to get a release from him because they're original works of art.
Yeah.
And because it's for a TV program that might be broadcast to BBC, you know, on BBC, it'll be on BBC in the autumn, but it might be broadcast all over the world, and they needed to have clearance, not for me, not for my image, but for the images behind me.
We had to
So I
sign a
managed to
form.
talk my brother into signing it off.
Yeah. And you have to do it really quickly as well, quite often, don't you? Because their production time scales are very short.
Oh yeah, no, I had about a day's notice actually.
Yeah, we had a visit from the Sky at Night. We've had a couple at the observatory, and you get a little form coming through by email. Can you do this by tomorrow, please? Find a relevant person and hope that they're in. Yeah, so we've got 15 of us now. Yeah, so it's just gone half past 7. There's a few names that I think are due to appear. We'll give people another 2 or 3 minutes. So I'll just say hello to everybody and intervene. So I said hi. The Beck Smiths up there in the corner on my screen anyway. There's Ruth and David. I think it's just Ruth that we can see. Yeah, and David Gwynn. Yeah, Jim from Dash in Suffolk. Mick, who just lives down the road from the observatory, and of course this is the observatory. We've done these fancy t-shirts me and Mick are wearing. It looks just like that, and that's the direction you're looking as well. That's the plough there, gives you an indication of this hedge here is growing a little bit too tall now. And yeah, we've got Peter and corner, Peter Waldron, right. Got Bernie Dodd, regular meeting attender, and Robin Nash, they often come to the hall. Hopefully we'll get in the hall next month. Hopefully you're up for it, because we'll do it very safely, obviously. We're not going to take any risks. I'll explain about that in a minute. We've also got Trevor and Mary who've joined us. Trevor and I think Michelle was going to join us as well. But we've just got Trevor as a friend. We've got Susan Southwood as well. I presume she's related.
Interloper.
Interloper, yeah. And Martin. Oh yeah, Martin. Thanks for your help, by the way, Martin.
What help have I given?
Oh, that was to Mick. Mick put out an appeal.
Yeah.
I heard that. Yeah.
I now know who Martin is.
Oh,
Right, you
hello, Mick.
recognise him?
Am I?
Haven't heard back from you since.
No, I'm waiting for more emails at the moment. You're the only one I've had so far, but I'm sure there'll be others.
Okay.
And we've got John Jonas as well, who usually helps out with the teas.
Hello, hello.
Get let off today.
Yeah, no teas. Sorry
Here comes
about
the treasurer.
that. I've had mine though.
Yeah. Here comes the treasurer, Andy. He normally takes your money at the door. And friend Jeremy Gaskell as well. Oh, David has left and is now rejoining. Right. Yeah, we're still getting people, so. Right. We've got some interesting echoes going on there. Is that one of the newcomers? Is that Jeremy? Hi. Hello. I'm going to try
What's going on over there?
by putting Jeremy on mute for a second. There was a little bit of an echo in somebody's laptop there. Got a rather long list down the side of my screen, so excuse me while I right. It seems to be okay now. I'm rather loud, aren't I? I think David was saying when we last spoke that I come across as rather loud and distorted.
You all right?
Am I okay? Am I clear enough?
Okay with me, anyway.
I know my voice isn't the clearest of voices anyway, but
Fine with me.
Jones.
yeah, as long as you can all hear me and I'm not saturating the microphone, that's all fine. Oh, the main thing is David's sounds fine, so that was very clear. Right, Andy is saying okay here. Can everybody see the chat? You don't have to look at it, but so if there are any questions that are coming up, I will maybe interrupt if they're very good, pertinent questions that need to be answered there and then. I will interrupt. if they come up on the chat, you might just want to type them in. I get the feeling this didn't go out to King's Lynn Society. So I've just got David and Jim from Dash. I think that was but it looks like pretty much everyone's here. I'm going to make a start now. I think it's 37 minutes past 7. Okay, that should do. Right. So yeah, just a little bit of admin then for those of you that are Breckland members. Not really admin. We're doing monthly newsletters. Our newsletter editor hasn't joined us at the moment. He might realise and come in. It's always a bit difficult to get the information out to everyone that I'd like to come along tonight to get the adverts out, because I'm not sure whether I email people, whether I actually click send, or I don't often get responses and things. I got some sent some emails out to people that I don't really know. Presumably they're interested friends of friends, and sent the link out to them. There's a little bit. It doesn't always get the takers that I'm expecting, but I think I've got familiar names here anyway. So hello everybody, yeah, and welcome new people. Yeah, always pleased to get as many of you as possible. So the hall hasn't actually reopened. I think they want to keep a children's group going on in the hall where we usually meet up in Great Ellingham, the recreation centre. I was gonna, obviously I'd like to met David in person, but I think this is pretty good. Oh, I've got one other person coming in, and this is a good second best. Hopefully we can all make it work. Still hope to open next month. Always hoping that, but I'll be asking our speaker next month, Mike Frost from the BAA. I think he runs the history section. And he's a good speaker. He knows a lot of stuff. He's going to be talking about green flash phenomenon, which is one of those optical things that people like to get really obsessed with seeing. It's a really difficult, rare thing to see. And hopefully, all being well, we can all space out in the hall next month. And if so, I will, in anticipation of that, send all the AGM documents out to everybody. And we've just got the financial summary and all the usual forms. So you've got them with 28 days notice. And that should be August the 14th. So fingers crossed we get in the hall. The newsletter is still monthly, so we'll have an August edition as well. If there's any input or ideas or nice things you want to put into that, or snippets that you find, they can go to newsletter@brecklandastro.org. And I'll go to Chris, and he's really good with getting them all in there and out on the 1st of the month. So we can try and do AGM at the end of next month's talk. If failing that, we'll do it in September. And Andy can do a talk. Andy's with us down there. He's joined just recently, yeah. And Andy's going to do a talk on was that Planet Vulcan in September. That's really interesting history. Everything's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, that's why we're all here. Yeah, we are recording tonight. Let's record less of my speaking as possible, and I'll just mention if you want to cover the very small costs we have, there's a donations button on the bottom of the website. It's a little PayPal thing that accepts any account, any cards, etc. So right, on to David, our speaker, David Southwood, Professor David Southwood. So he sent us a very neat abstract. Obviously done some academic style work before. We've not had abstracts from our speakers before, but that's what it is. It's a little synopsis. It's Mars is the obvious target for space exploration beyond the moon. And the history of Mars exploration has been checkered, as you know, from all the crashes we've had. I think there was a point when it was about 50% of Mars probes had crash landed, or something had happened to them. They hadn't made it to the surface. Hadn't functioned. So Professor Southwood worked at different times with Russian, American, and European programs in Mars exploration, and described it as a mixture of delirium, delight, and disasters. And he's going to share some memories and just look at what we now know about Mars, and hopefully give a very up-to-date view of that and where we're going, perhaps, in the near future, what space agencies can do, and what we're all planning to do and how it will happen. So that's it. I will leave it. I'll hand the floor over to David, and you can begin sharing your screen. So if I could ask everyone to mute, and we shall begin. So just find your mute buttons. Thank you very much. All right.
Okay, well, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
I hope you can. So here you are. I'm going to talk about Mars. As Dan has said, Mars is, for me and for many scientists, the Death Star. I've been involved with programs that have failed, but also with programs that have succeeded. Anyway, here I am. I'm attached to Imperial College in London, but I used to be the Director of Science and Robotic Exploration at the European Space Agency. The little movie you're seeing there, the loop, is actually data from a European Mars orbiter called Mars Express. It's still there. And because it's got binocular vision, although the spacecraft is flying high above the Martian surface, because it's got stereoscopic views, you can then morph the data to sort of pretend you're flying over the surface. This was a unique thing, and I still absolutely love imagining flying across the surface of Mars like you're doing right now. Okay, so Mars, the hardest planet to explore. That's possibly not quite true. I think Pluto would be pretty hard to explore, but we've defined that as not being a planet, so there you are. Mars, has anyone seen it this month? It's very distinctive in the sky. It
Yes.
has a definite red tinge, and it should be rising tonight, if I got this right, round about midnight, although that's in probably it's probably around midnight in Norfolk. Maybe a bit different because all my data is from Plymouth, which is a little further to the west. Rise in the east, and it'll be somewhere near the moon, in fact, tonight. So it's a nice time of year to look at Mars. And of course, Mars is moving into our interest because in a week or so's time, there will be an American Mars mission, Mars 2020, being launched. And I'll come to that at the end. That will arrive at Mars in February next year. So Mars, as I guess you all know, is kind of one of the terrestrial planets, along with Venus. When the solar system formed, Mars, Earth, and Venus were all in the zone where life might have evolved. So that's kind of the Goldilocks zone, it's sometimes called. So there is a great interest in it. In fact, it's probably the one place where life might have existed in the past. Whether life could exist now is an interesting question. Frankly, I think something approaching life is going on, and I'll come to that later. So Mars is smaller than the Earth, so the gravity is about 40% of ours. It gets less sunlight. It's twice as far from the sun as we are. Its year is more or less double our year, slightly less than double our year. And in fact, it has its own sort of day called a sol. And in its year, there are 667 sols. And if you go to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in America, where they, or indeed to where they monitor Mars rovers anywhere on the planet, they work with the sol. It's just slightly different from our day in length. The rotation rate is once every 24 hours and 40 minutes, so slightly longer. Where does it really differ from us? Well, its atmosphere. If it had an oxygen atmosphere in its past, something went severely wrong. Its atmosphere now is primarily carbon dioxide, but also if you look at the pressure on the Earth, the pressure more or less where we are, all of us are at the moment, is around 1,000 millibars. On Mars, the surface pressure is 7.6 millibars. So Mars rather carelessly appears to have lost its atmosphere. In fact, the atmosphere appears to have been dragged off by something called the solar wind. And that's due to the fact that Mars does not have the magnetic protection that the Earth has, that is an ordered magnetic field that holds off the solar wind. That's somewhat puzzling because Venus, which also doesn't have a magnetic field, has managed to retain an atmosphere. So that's the first mystery. Now Mars, I think, is the place that I'm most want to see continuously explored, and we'll see why. It's clearly very close to the Earth. It shares sort of a common heritage. Once upon a time, Venus might have been the planet one would have cared most about, but life could not occur on Venus as we know it now. Mars has this possibility of life either in the past or more likely sometime in the future. The public interest in Mars switched towards Mars from the Moon as being probably the main interest of the general public in earlier times, but in 1877, an Italian astronomer called Schiaparelli sketched what he thought he was seeing through his telescope, which was regular structures on the surface of Mars. This is a view of one of his sketches there. See regular structures. Now, you probably know that English people don't speak foreign languages, nor do Americans. There must be something to do with speaking English, I don't know. But Schiaparelli called these things canali. And that got translated into English wrongly as canals. What Schiaparelli said, they were channels, and the canali is channels in Italian. But the idea there were canals, that is something made by something like human beings or beings of some kind, grabbed the popular imagination in the late 19th century. And really, I don't think Mars has left the popular imagination since. Certainly, by 1898, it loomed very large. I come from Imperial College, and possibly you know one of our most famous graduates, H.G. Wells. And he, in 1898, wrote a book about the Martian threat. There is H.G., Herbert George Wells, picture from Imperial College archives. And I don't know. I should ask you to raise your hands. I normally ask, how many people have read The War of the Worlds? You've possibly seen movies or whatever. I can see some people have. Good for you. It's one of my favorite books, partly because I may come from Devonshire, but I lived much of my time in Wimbledon, and anyone who's read the book knows that the Martians land in southwest suburbs of London. And I'd always wanted to see Kingston destroyed by a ray gun, which happens in the book, along with Woking and various other places. Wimbledon more or less survives, so that's okay. But the start of the book I find incredibly resonant. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed that we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this Earth with envious eyes. And slowly but surely, they drew their plans against us. That's the first paragraph of War of the Worlds. If you can put the book down after starting that way, you're a better man than I am. It's really a wonderful book. In fact, there was another Wells took it up, Orson Welles. Orson Welles, famous actor, but also a major producer and director. In 1938, for the Mercury Theatre of the Air, put on a radio production. And just as H.G. Wells had set the War of the Worlds in places that people knew that they could recognize in London, particularly in southwest London, Orson Welles set them around New York, set the whole thing around New York City. What happened, since he did it so well, the radio listeners gained the impression that the Martians had really landed. And there was panic in the streets with traffic jams of people trying to flee. As Wells's program described the Martians knocking down power stations and crossing New Jersey, heading towards New York. It's not really clear quite how true that is, but it was certainly, in my experience, the first example of fake news, but probably the most effective fake news ever. If you can find the radio program, you can find it on the internet. It's well worth listening to. Okay, well, I'm going to move you on a little closer. I was quite young. I was a schoolboy, primary school, in 1954. And there was something that I think many, many children in my generation had called the Children's Encyclopedia by Arthur Mee. Wonderful book, taught me an enormous amount. But if you looked up Mars in that book, it still had canals and deserts, and the idea that there was vegetation around the canals. And of course, Mars does have polar ice caps, and indeed the polar ice caps are marked. This is from 1954, this picture. And of course, the space age was to begin only 3 years later. And within 10 years, the Russians would have been attempting to send spaceships to Mars. So it just shows how rapidly things can change. In fact, in the 1950s, I'm sure you've all heard of Wernher von Braun, the man who really put the Americans on the moon. He did a little bit of damage to London by firing rockets at it in the Second World War, but he's the man who sort of founded modern rocketry. But his motivation certainly was exploration. And there's a wonderful book called The Mars Project, where he describes his program, what he'd like to do to go to Mars with a fleet of spacecraft, with human beings on the spacecraft and then little shuttles to take you down to the surface, etc. The weirdest thing is that he missed something out. This is writing around 1950. At the big surprise, he did not foresee the computer revolution, that he could not foresee any serious precursor to robot exploration of Mars. And of course, that was going to come really not long afterwards. But just to show you how long ago 1950 was. However, let's go back to the Death Star. Of 56 space missions to Mars since 1960, 30 have failed and 26 have succeeded. There's no other celestial object that has that level of catastrophe associated with it. And you might ask, why do we keep trying? Well, it really is an interesting place. On that strip across the top, in fact, I've got a list of the missions. Don't turn your heads, you don't need to read them. There's 56 of them there. The green ones are the successes, and the red ones are the failures. And so you see 6 failures to start before the Russians the Americans successfully orbited Mars with Mariner 4, and that was in the that was around 1970. Oh. So there you are. I think I've probably convinced you that there may be a curse of Mars. In fact, it is a strange thing because, as we'll see, some of the missions didn't fail because of any of the difficulty associated with Mars. Mars with enough atmosphere to be a nuisance, but not enough to help you land, does make it a very challenging place to land. But on the other hand, quite a few of those missions weren't even supposed to land, yet they failed. So there is a certain superstition amongst Mars-faring folk about... So in 1973, for example, 3 failures, one after the other. The Russians were very early in the game. They flew far more early spacecraft to Mars, all of them failing. Mars 4, Mars 6, Mars 7. Finally, in 76, the US succeeded not only in getting into orbit, but landing on Mars. In fact, it was called Viking, and it landed for the 4th of July, I think it was, really around the 200th birthday of the United States. Strangely enough, it took another 20 years before the Americans went back to Mars. And that is an interesting point. The reason, I think, was hubris. The space scientists had promised they would find life on Mars. And although Viking found an interesting place, severe dust storms, all sorts of things, what it didn't find was any trace of life at all. And I think that shows a danger about promising too much and not delivering. Anyhow, it wasn't until the 90s that the Americans started going back with a whole series of explorers, of little rovers, robotic explorers. So how did I become involved in all this? I'm not American and I'm not Russian. But strangely enough, it was the Russians that got me involved. Well, actually, you could say it was these two people. I don't know if anyone recognizes them. There's Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister, and that's Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Margaret Thatcher started the end of the Cold War with this meeting. I don't think she gets enough credit for it myself. She liked Mr. Gorbachev. She felt she could do business with him. She told her friend Ronald Reagan, and that started the end of the Cold War. But it also sent me off to Moscow. Margaret Thatcher wanted something that we could collaborate with the Russians on, something where preferably we would gain quite as much as they would. And she realized that the Russians really were far ahead in space exploration. So maybe this was something that the British space scientists could cooperate in. So along with another scientist, I was sent off to Moscow. Very exciting, very interesting. Of course, the Cold War was still in existence then. This is 1985. Cold War had a few more years to run. And what was quite remarkable, pure luck on my part, is I already knew the civilian head of the Soviet space science program, a man called Roald Sugdiev, who now lives in the United States, and believe it or not, married the granddaughter of President Eisenhower. He lives now just outside Washington, D.C. He's in his 90s now. Very interesting man. I'd met him when I first went to Moscow in the 70s. So I went with a delegation to meet the Russians to talk about space cooperation, and Sagdayev picked me out immediately, came up and gave me a bear hug. I have to say the security guys looked at me very strangely after that. But we started a cooperation. This was what we wanted to cooperate on, an incredible program that the Russians set up called Phobos. Mars has two little moons, Phobos and Deimos, and this extraordinarily challenging program that the Russians announced, which they wanted Western scientists to cooperate in, was to put a spacecraft in orbit, in fact, two spacecraft in orbit around the moon of Mars, called Phobos, and drop little explorers, little robots onto the surface. The thing that's being shown being dropped there is called a frog, and it was to bounce around on the surface and make measurements. Incredibly exciting, and that was my introduction to working in the Soviet Union. Very, very interesting times. In fact, Phobos, you won't be surprised to hear, there were two Phobos spacecraft and both failed. The first Phobos spacecraft, I actually went out to Russia for the launch, was lost en route to Mars when a command failure caused its thrusters to shut down, so it never reconnoitered with Mars. It didn't go into orbit or anything. Phobos 2 was launched. It successfully got into our Mars orbit. In fact, it did 3 orbits. And it was approaching the moon, Phobos, when contact was lost. Yet another failure and an enormous frustration. Anyhow, the difficult thing then was, what would the Russians do? Well, it was still the Soviet Union, but it was only within a year or two of ending. But they decided that there was such a propaganda gain in having so many Western scientists interested in cooperating with them, they said they would set up a big Mars spacecraft called Mars 92 to be launched in 1992. In fact, that spacecraft became Mars 94 and eventually Mars 96. All through that time, I was commuting to Moscow with other scientists, other Western scientists. It was an extraordinarily ambitious mission, and you'll see some of what it contained, but unfortunately not from Russian sources. In the 8 years, of course, the Soviet Union became Russia, and that certainly caused the delay. It was extremely interesting visiting Russia all through that period. Every day, every time you went, it was a change. Then 1996 came, Mars 96 was launched. The orbiter and lander all ready, but they were lost in a launch failure. It wasn't a big explosion on the pad. In fact, the irony was people who'd gone out to Kazakhstan to see the launch were on their way home, or way back to Moscow, when what happened was the fourth stage of the rocket, the thing that would move the orbiter of Earth into a transit to Mars, failed. So the spacecraft Mars 96 was stuck in Earth orbit. And that was another, yet again, disaster at Mars. By 1996, we hit the peak of the number of failures over the number of successes. Gradually, thanks to our American friends, we've begun to be more successful at Mars than failing. 1998, Europe stepped in. When you build an instrument for a spacecraft, often you can build another one quite quickly. Sometimes you more or less built two anyhow. And the European Space Agency decided to pick up the pieces from the failure of Mars 96 and offer to the Western Europeans who'd been intending to fly instruments on the Russian spacecraft the chance to fly instruments on a European spacecraft. This spacecraft was going to be built cheaper, faster, better, called Mars Express. And it was going to be built cheap and fast simply by using the fact that the Europeans were already building a big spacecraft called Rosetta, which some of you may know was launched after Mars Express. But a lot of the parts and even the architecture came from Rosetta, but it was reduced in size to do a very fast mission to Mars. So 1998, Europe stepped in. Big German and French Mars 96 instruments, and probably the biggest instrument of all was, of course, a proposed lander built by the British, led by Colin Pillinger. I don't know if most of you probably remember Colin. He was a fellow West Countryman that I'd known for a very long time. I met him during the Apollo program, the American Apollo programs. But Colin was a real dynamo. I mean, he managed to persuade the British to build Beagle 2. The technology was more or less there because already the British had built an awful lot of the Huygens lander that was to go eventually to Saturn, to Titan. But anyhow, we decided to do it, and it was a wonderful thing. In 2000, it was due to launch on June the 2nd, 2003. In 2001, I was appointed Director of Science at ESA, which unfortunately one of my numerous responsibilities was to getting Mars Express built, launched, and delivered to Mars. That was a charge enough, but I also had to deliver Beagle 2 to Mars. So Beagle 2 was sort of hitching a ride on the mothership, which was primarily my responsibility. We did get it all together, and we got Beagle out to Kazakhstan and comfortably on top of this rocket. We were using a Russian launcher called a Soyuz. And there's sort of kind of like a naval tradition. The rocket is rolled out horizontally, and all the people who walk alongside it, it's like launching a ship. And then the thing is cantilevered up. Quite an extraordinary sight. There it is, Mars Express on top of the Soyuz rocket, ready to go off to Mars in 2003. People tell me that that chap in the white coat is me because I was wearing a white coat that day. I don't believe it. I'm sure I was never that fat, but there you are. It's funny how the camera can play tricks, isn't it? But there I am again, actually standing in front of the launch pad, and below us is the bunker where the control is sort of covered with tiles. You can see it. It's really remarkably close to the rocket. Very, very exciting. Of course, here comes the launch. The horrifying thing about seeing a launch in Kazakhstan is the amount of flames. There's no water in Kazakhstan available to douse the flames. So you see your baby consumed by fire, then gradually it lifts itself out of the fire into the sky. It's an extraordinary experience. I recommend anyone who can find a way to get an invitation for launch. So I had to deliver Mars Express and the lander Beagle 2 to Mars. Well, there is the last picture we had of Beagle 2 until 2015. That was taken actually about 3 days before Christmas, as Beagle 2 left Mars Express. Because we followed it, we know exactly the trajectory it was on, and it was absolutely nominal. So we were sure Beagle 2 would go down to Mars successfully. I thought, well, that's my job over. I delivered it. You know, I'd go home now. And since it was Christmas, that didn't seem such a bad idea. So I left Germany, where we oversaw the release, and flew back to London for Christmas. Sadly, it was to be a long time before we saw Beagle or ever heard from it again. Colin, it was deeply upsetting to Colin. It was deeply upsetting to me. He never really could give up hope, and we kept searching for the signal. It should have come in on Christmas Day, and it didn't. We tried for more than a month to pick it up. In fact, we only found out in the end what had happened much later, and there's a reason to be proud of what we found out in the end, and I'll share that with you in a minute. Let me first digress to say about Mars Express. I think because we're British, we tend to underestimate the significance of this particular mission. In Germany, France, or Italy, they think it's one of the greatest successes in Mars exploration. In fact, the first thing it did was give me another headache. It was going to look for water under the surface of Mars. And you do that with a sort of radar, which is really just stretched out pieces of wire, stretched out in 3 orthogonal directions, and then you send signals down and you pick them up again using a radar system to detect whether there's water on the surface or under the surface of the planet. In fact, sure enough, we discovered ice, a lot of ice under the planet, and eventually, years and years after years of seeking, discovered liquid water, a lake under the surface of Mars. That didn't come until around 2014. But what happened, and that you can see it here, the antenna, 20 meters long, so enormous, and we'd never been able to try it out in gravity on Earth. We simulated it, and it failed to come out properly. You'll see it's stuck. And that's kind of a complication. What do you do? Well, you've got to get it to unbend, and you can kick it. You can't send somebody up there to kick it. You turn that knee there towards the sun and away from the sun to thermally stress it until it unclips. The whole system resembles a blind man's stick. So it sort of unfolds. It's folded up to travel to Mars. It's supposed to just open out by being shaken. We got that open, and then we have one more of those to open, by which time we'd looked in much more detail about the way it opened. And there were all sorts of concerns. Could it have whiplash? Could it hit the spacecraft? In the end, one of the terrible things about being director of science is you have to say yes or no. And in the end, probably only a scientist would do this. An engineer would have said no. I'm a scientist, I said yes. It opened totally successfully and absolutely no damage. Otherwise, if it had damaged the spacecraft after losing Beagle 2, I think that would have been the end of my career. Moreover, you wouldn't be listening to me tonight, I don't suppose, but there you are. Okay, so we did find water. That Journal of Record, the Evening Standard, Eureka, we've found water on Mars. And that's actually worth crowing over. It was a big discovery. In fact, that was discovered with the radar below the surface. It was ice, in fact. Most remarkably, there was a stereoscopic camera, the one from which you saw the movie at the beginning, a high-resolution stereoscopic camera, the best camera flown to Mars at the time. In fact, afterwards, the Americans started flying effectively the same camera. And it discovered, well, this is the pole of Mars. That's water ice frozen in perpetuity because the sun doesn't get to it in the crater. So there's frozen water sitting there. The ice around the edge isn't water. It's dry ice. It's carbon dioxide, a sort of rime that's come out of the atmosphere in the cold. So there you are, water on Mars. There really is water on Mars. Is there life on Mars? Well, here another journal of record that some of you may know, named after a celestial body, namely the sun. Methane, actually, perhaps I don't know whether the sun ever gets the news wrong, but here is a case where they did. NASA's historic discovery of methane on the red planet. In fact, methane was discovered by Mars Express 5 years earlier, and the sun somehow missed that, but there you are. The significance about methane is, it's what convinces me that something is going on Mars now. Methane doesn't last very long. If you just take a molecule of methane, it'll be broken up by the sunlight shining on it because there's no protection from an atmosphere. It's got a lifetime individual molecule of a matter of perhaps around, I think it's 600 years, which is more or less nothing. Methane must be being created if we can detect large amounts of methane on the planet. How do you make methane? Well, something up there has wind, as the sun put it. I don't think it means there are cows, which are a major source of methane on this planet, but organic activity might be going on somewhere under the surface or near the surface, giving rise to a continuous outflow of methane into the atmosphere. It's also possible that volcanoes might create a source of methane. Mars has volcanoes, but they're all extinct as far as we can see. So my money is on organic activity of some kind, and it's the reason, for me, we should go on exploring Mars. Mars Express, I'm probably plugging this far too much. You probably know some of it. But Mars Express rewrote Martian history. The remarkable thing was we saw that once half of the planet was covered with water. You can see this because you could find clays that must have been created in a very damp environment. And indeed, it did rewrite the history of Mars, a much wetter history than anyone had imagined. And indeed, the Mars rovers, the American Mars rovers that are now there, and the future European ones, their targets are really provided from the discoveries made by Mars Express showing the wet history of Mars. I won't go through the other discoveries, but just to say, it was quite, for me, it was really incredibly important. Remarkably, it's still operating, it still orbits Mars every day, and it's got enough fuel to remain there until 2026. So probably I paid industry just a bit too much for over-engineering. If it's still, the lifetime was supposed to be, I think, 3 years. It's kind of exceeded its lifetime. But that's the joy. It's a wonderful machine, and it's still being used for science right now. What happened to Beagle 2? Well, that was discovered by American friends, but in fact, they took the pictures, and the University of Leicester did the analysis that detected Beagle 2, its parachute and the rear cover that protected it as it came into the atmosphere. Beagle 2, since we can now see it, we realize the antenna, it sort of unfolded. And it had to unfold three items. It unfolded 2, and then the third unfold would have been the antenna that allowed it to phone home to London. Well, we can see there are only 2 deployed elements. What failed was something mechanical, possibly just a piece of dust in the mechanism. What is proven by this is that Beagle 2 landed almost perfectly where it was supposed to land. So if any of you are British, you can feel proud that the first time the British tried to land something on Mars, they did successfully. And there's no other country in the world about which you can say that. So just share a little pride there. The failure was really the Martian environment, almost certainly dust preventing a mechanism, a mechanical mechanism from working properly. Extremely sad, so close. But here's what the Americans now do. I now work with the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. This is the descent of the Curiosity rover. And this is the most remarkable mechanism. The sky. Well, the movie, of course, was a simulation. The whole thing of that, well, it's kind of jump jet technology, isn't it? I mean, we were talking of cooperating with the Americans on what's now called the ExoMars program when I was in charge. And they said, well, we can land using the sky crane. Of course, they hadn't landed Curiosity at the time. I took one look at it and thought, that cannot work. Well, don't take me seriously. My judgment was wrong there. It worked perfectly. And in fact, the mission was delayed by 2 years, not because of any problem with the sky crane, but to do with the mechanisms associated with steering the wheels on the surface. I found that very ironical. But what a way to land. That's the way to go. Mars is incredibly hard to land. Beagle would have landed with sort of bouncing around on balloons that slowly deflated to put it down on the surface. Otherwise, it's very hard because you have to use parachutes, but you can't get enough parachutes to, sorry, you're getting my email coming up. Okay, so this is the way you land big things. Curiosity is about the size of a mini vehicle, mini car. I kind of like the way they choose a British car to as their description, but it's just about exactly the same size as a standard mini. Something of similar size will be going to Mars in 2 years' time from Europe, and in particular, it's being put together, the rover being put together not so far from Norfolk, in Stevenage in Hertfordshire. This is the Rosalind Franklin rover, so named after a British scientist. I'm sure you've all heard of Rosalind Franklin. Of course, somebody who made major, by her work, made major steps forward in our understanding about life on Earth. So it's kind of appropriate to name the lander after her. And that'll be going just about almost exactly 2 years from now. It should have been going this year, but it's a victim of COVID. In March, it was decided because of the problems of, we're cooperating with the Russians and they are launching it, and the problems of COVID and the ensuring that we could do the putting of everything together effectively led to its postponement. Better safe than sorry. It's better not to risk. You test and test and test before you send something up. You have to be sure. So I guess that place there is not Mars, but that's what it'll look like on Mars. I don't know if Stevenage looks like that. I guess it does, but there you go. Okay, well, what's coming, actually being launched this year in about 10 days' time by my friends at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Well, it's something incredible. It's called Ingenuity, a helicopter. The rover is called Perseverance. This, for me, is going to be the big fun of the mission. Being a helicopter working on Mars. Here is it being tested at JPL. In a vacuum. Well, not quite a vacuum, but of course Mars's atmosphere is, by many standards, a vacuum. So getting anything to fly in the atmosphere is quite remarkable. Now I have to say the main point of the Mars 2020 mission is the rover called Perseverance, but it's a terrific thing. It's going to start searching for samples that it will cache, it will hide away in stores eventually later in the next decade for a spacecraft to fly to Mars and pick up the samples of geology or Marsology to bring back to the Earth for analysis. Really, please remember, the helicopter is it's a technical demonstration. If it fails, it really doesn't matter. They'll just have to try harder next time. It's not really part of the mission. And indeed, I'm on an advisory group to the director of Jet Propulsion Lab, and we said, don't take a risk. If this fails, then it will cause the whole mission to be regarded as a failure, which is certainly bad and false, just as the failure of the lander with Mars Express gave everybody the impression, at least in Britain, that Mars Express had been a failure. Anyhow, you see how good my advice is. The helicopter's going to Mars. I don't know. I will still keep giving advice, but clearly keep getting it wrong as well. Okay, so there you are. That's the immediate future. We'll be seeing this thing landing in February next year, and I just long to see that helicopter working. But I really should be longing to see all of the science that Perseverance, the rover, is going to do. There you are, Perseverance and Ingenuity. Those are the names of the two little explorers. I'm going to finish by taking you to Mars using that wonderful German camera. This is a crater on Mars named after the man who invented the camera, Gerhard Neukum, now sadly passed away. But the binaural capability, the binocular capability, gives you this capability to imagine you're flying over Mars. It's something I would absolutely love to do. Probably I'm too heavy for the helicopter though. Look at this extraordinary valley just winding through. Doesn't it make you feel that once water might have been carving out these structures? This valley is called Mor Vallis, and Vallis means valley, it's Latin, and Morth. Hands up, who can translate Morth?
Is it Welsh for Mars?
It's Cornish for Mars.
Ah,
It's also Welsh for Mars,
Yeah,
quite
Welsh.
right, very good. Excellent, I'm glad to have a Welsh, somebody familiar with Welsh in the, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Cornish, but I like to think of it as Cornish, coming from where I come from. Yes, so there's a little bit of Mars that is Celtic, and I just am waiting to see us Europeans going back to Mars in a couple of years' time. Very exciting. And indeed, I'm hanging in there for my American friends. I still am attached to the Jet Propulsion Lab, so I'll be following that closely. Okay, so there you are. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. You can all unmute now, so David can hear the round of applause.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you very much. That was a great thing to end on as well.
so I don't know if you've got questions or...
Well, we've got a lot to look forward to then in the next couple of years, and on, you know, perhaps 2 or 3 years to hear the science actually coming out from the observations. It's fantastic. Yeah, I'll wait to see if there are any questions and things. Andy has got one, I think.
Yeah, just a couple of things first before I ask my question. Just thanks to Sally and Paul for sort of helping arrange this. That was very kind of you. Shame we didn't get to do this in person, but hey ho. And also just a little bit of a thing from us. We've jumped through all the hoops that PayPal have set us, and we're now a charity with them, so we get extra money from them. My question to Professor Southwood, which is a very fantastic talk, thank you very much, is how is Rosalind Franklin going to land? Is it going to be sky crane, or is it too crazy? Is it going to be airbag or somewhere?
No, it's going to be airbags, and in fact, there've been a variety of thoughts. Crushable structures is the other major possibility, where you deliberately crumple something as you come down. But I think really the future probably is the sort of thing the Americans have shown is possible. And beyond ExoMars, beyond the next European mission, I'm fairly sure we'll be involved in the sample return mission. And my guess is that will involve sky crane, which is a remarkably neat system. Once you've seen that it does work, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, it looks as unlikely. I don't know if you've ever seen, you know, a jump jet flying, but it does look a very unlikely thing, but it does seem to work.
I did manage to meet one of the engineers for Rosalind Franklin a few years back. His name was David Peacover, and he said it was like building Rosalind Franklin was trying to stuff a bathtub full of as many wires as you can, and then trying to make them like go into various places. So that was very cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's the point is you get these chances to go a place like Mars. Number one, you want to send as much intelligence with your robot as you can. And number two, you don't get the opportunity very often. And, you know, it really pushes the limit in terms of trying to squeeze everything in whilst making sure that everything works. Because the other thing you have to worry about is things go wrong. So you always want some redundancy in the system, some recovery possibilities, and those work in exactly the wrong direction because you don't want two of everything, just to be sure. And so you have to make compromises. With Beagle 2, the compromise there, partly because they discovered very late in the day, only when they came to doing tests with the airbags, that they needed a larger parachute and to redesign the parachute at the last moment. And that parachute then was bigger, and it had to be packed inside the inside Beagle 2. And of course, space was at an absolute premium along with mass. So what was not included was some kind of communication system on the dissent. And there was lots and lots of criticism of that. Frankly, if I had to make the decision again, I would still go with the way we did Beagle 2. That is, cramming it to the brim with everything we could to actually work on the surface. But you can probably tell. I mean, I think Colin Pillinger was an absolute genius to get the momentum and get many British people to believe they could do it. I think it turned around British space activities. It was when we all started realizing Britain could do things in space. I'd say there wasn't, the reason we've got a British Space Agency now, or UK Space Agency, probably was to do with Beagle 2. Many people wouldn't see the connection, but for me, I think Colin did everybody a big favour.
Yeah, agreed.
Hats off, here. Hats off to me. John.
Yeah, David, yeah, question here. Where does Elon Musk with his SpaceX and all that fit into all this program? Because he's got some ideas as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, well, I've tried to stay clear of, listen, my capacity to predict the future, you've already worked out isn't very good. But Elon Musk, it's clear he's decided he wants to get people to Mars. I think there is it's not so much a problem to get them to Mars, it's getting them back. And so I think if you're content with a one-way ticket, it's probably something that's doable. Doing return trips is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
You've got to spend a lot of time on Mars before the conditions are right to come back to the Earth. So you can imagine doing that with robots. With people, it's very hard, or else they have to stay on Mars. That's quite a jump. You know, I think, what is it, Jeff Bezos wants to land people on the moon. I'd actually put my money on Jeff Bezos to get to succeed in that first. But listen, I'm very cautious about saying that Elon Musk isn't capable of doing things after what he's done already. So, you know, he does. What I will say about Elon Musk, we've had him speak in London at the Royal Aeronautical Society a couple of times. And, you know, needless to say, the real engineers go in hoping to trip him up by asking nasty questions. He is very, very confident about his grasp of the engineering. Yeah. So don't imagine he's just some spoilt rich boy millionaire. He really knows what he's doing and very much in charge of the engineering of what he's doing. So he's the sort of person that you would want to, with the sort of knowledge you'd want to have if you really wanted somebody to do what he's claiming he's going to do. Just, it seems remarkable.
Well, on a similar line, of course, is the difficulty bringing the samples back from Opportunity. And that's not an easy task either, because you have to get there and then you bring the stuff back again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you don't do it. You do it with several spacecraft. First of all, you do some of the previous geology with the new rover, Perseverance, wandering over the surface and leaving a cache-sealed container with samples already collected. So you want the samples, if you like, collected before you think about going to pick them up. Then with the pickup, you send something into orbit around Mars and then something else to drop down to the surface. That thing is the tricky one. But after all, we've landed things on the moon and come back. The Russians did it, not with people, and then the Americans did it, bringing back people from the surface of the moon. You've got to land something that's got rockets in it capable of pushing you up from the surface. It's a bit tougher to get off Mars than off the moon. Then the tricky thing that next you encounter is you've got to rendezvous with, so to speak, the mothership in Mars orbit that will then bring the samples back to Earth, and then you've got to land the samples. That's, relatively speaking, child's play. All I can say is I just trust Mars is in a very cooperative mood. I'm afraid I'm still a little bit superstitious about Mars.
Thank you for that.
There are people willing to die on Mars, though, aren't there? I've heard. Astronauts or Martianauts, or whatever you call them. So I'm just thinking it might be that we go with the Society for Popular Astronomy. Here's suggestion about taking required provisions over there first and constructing something ready for humans to live in, if you like. And that sounds very much like a long-term plan. I mean, just speculating, but do you think that's a possible future?
Well, yes, the big fight in this area is over, do you do that first on the moon, or do you go direct to Mars? And for many, many years, particularly in the United States, the idea was we have to go to Mars. We have to send people to Mars. Clearly, you would send robots to prepare the ground. But I think I'd rather do it on the moon first and build habitation on the moon. That, I think, is doable. The moon is relatively close. You know, it takes 3 days or so to get to the moon. It takes 6 months to get to Mars. So, but people are looking at the architecture. And indeed, there are British people working on it. There are certainly designs for habitation construction on the moon. I would imagine you would build them robotically for people to then follow if you wanted to establish a lunar colony, and then Mars would be the next stop. That's a particular view I have. It just seems doable. It's not the most radical view. I think if you talk to people in the Mars Society, for example, they believe in going to Mars first. They want to start colonizing Mars and terraforming it. I must say, maybe I'm just too cautious.
Well, terraforming is a bit unrealistic, really, given the size of the planet. But it's just going to be quite a way off, isn't it? Changing the atmosphere.
Yeah, listen, it's the sort of thing you can think about. I think you learn an awful lot thinking about things that may be just beyond the horizon or way beyond the horizon. Thinking about how one might do it, could it be done? Mars has evolved over many, many aeons. Once upon a time, maybe it was much closer to being like the Earth. It looks as if it probably was. So it's not impossible to think of it returning to that state.
Yeah, well, that leads me on to my other fairly burning question that I've saved. By the way, if any of you have got questions, yeah, please feel free to just put your hands up or something on your camera. Which is the methane thing, which you mentioned midway through the talk, that you discovered with Mars Express methane for the first time.
Yeah.
Have you got any further? You must have got some.
Oh yeah, methane. In fact, there was one mission I did not talk about, which was the European Trace Gas Orbiter. Europe currently launched in 2018, a couple of years ago, launched a pretty big spacecraft directed at measuring things like methane. The trace gases in the atmosphere, the more complicated gases, the ones that could be linked to organic activity on the surface, also to water. And it's been mapping methane fairly intensely now for best part of 18 months, I think. So that's being done. It's being done in cooperation with the Americans. We've got a kind of division of labor in Mars exploration, possibly because of the success of Mars Express. We get to do much of the, let's say, exploration of the things like methane, the complicated chemistry that may or may not be going on in the planet, because that should drive exploration down on the surface. So that's trace gas orbiter is, so there are two European spacecraft in orbit around Mars at the moment, Mars Express and the trace gas orbiter. It carried, trace gas orbiter, you may remember, carried with it a lander called Schiaparelli, and that made a very big hole in the surface of Mars. There was an error. The retro rockets fired too short a time. They shut down, and I'm afraid Schiaparelli hit the surface at quite a rate of knots and made a large hole, which the Americans were very glad to show us a picture of. I don't know whether I like seeing a picture of it, but there you are. So that was, but I mean, again, the lander actually was a technical demonstrator. The real science of the 2018 mission is being done with the trace gas orbiter. And it's preparing for the next decade or so of the exploration of Mars. It's doing the mapping. You know, when you go down on the surface, there's a very limited capability to move any great distance. So mapping beforehand is extremely important.
Was that the one they mixed up with, hi Ben, with inches? They mixed up metric and imperial units, which led to that.
That was an American. No, that was not Schiaparelli's problem.
Okay.
That was an American problem. They've kind of failed to learn the new money or whatever it is that. Anyhow, these things happen. We're all human.
Yeah, yeah. Bernie had a question.
I read an article some time ago about a proposal to set up an initial base on Phobos, the moon Phobos. Is there any reality to that?
It's a live issue. It's I mean, the Russian idea from 30 years ago is still a live idea. Personally, I'd like to see it. I mean, first of all, Phobos and Deimos are themselves very interesting. How on earth did they get there? They're rather close to Mars and should have been broken up by the gravitational stresses. They're inside what's called the Roche limit, but they're probably captured asteroids or dead comets. So they make them, so they are very interesting targets themselves, but if you land on Phobos, you can spend a lot of time looking at Mars. So it's still, I think, something that many space scientists have in their wish list.
I expect you get a really nice view of Mars from up there as well.
Yeah, it's
Oh.
yes, no, it's it would be spectacularly big. You know, the Earth looks kind of disappointing from the moon, but Mars would dominate your view if you were on Phobos.
Of course, we can all now do that with wonderful software such as Celestia and Stellarium and things like that, which is what we often do, which is quite inspirational.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, are there any other questions and things or comments people want to make? There was a little thing. Oh, John, yeah.
Just a quickie, really. This huge gash, Valles Marineris. I mean, it must be a very interesting area to explore because you're going to have all the strata going all the way down. But presumably, we can't get anything down there, can we?
Ah, sorry, I didn't catch the first bit of your question. You were perhaps too close to the microphone.
The huge gash, Valles Marineris.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, any chance that we can land something inside there to look at the
Oh,
strata?
there you get the battle. But good question, John. There you get the battle between the scientists and the engineers. The engineers want to land on a dead flat, totally unencumbered plain that is about as exciting as landing in the middle of the Sahara, because it's, let's say, it meets engineering requirements. And of course, the scientists want to explore the geology. And particularly if you believe there's been volcanic activity, tectonic activity, you want to look for exposed geology. That, of course, kind of, well, you can do it. I mean, Curiosity has been wandering around the edge of a crater looking down into it and so on, but there is a conflict there between engineering requirements and science requirements. They do contradict. One thing I should say that Rosalind Franklin will do, it carries a drill. And although there is a drill on the current American rovers, doesn't really penetrate very far into the surface. The Rosalind Franklin drill will go down 2 meters. So really get where, let's say, the radiation from the sun cannot wipe out, let's say, organic activity. If, you know, so Rosalind Franklin will be really looking possibly deep enough to see something that might at least be a precursor of life. Sorry, I changed your question and answered something.
Don't worry, that's fine.
Oh, that's great. Well, I suppose it could discover some fascinating chemistry down there, which will unfortunately put the poo-poos on the life idea, which is always nice for us all to believe. It's some kind of bacteria, like the Alan Hills fossil. It was always intriguing, but it made the headlines and it made things popular, didn't it? But not sure.
I've not given up hope. There are several other places in the solar system where you could get some form of, well, formation of life or something before life. One of the most difficult things I've come across, I'm a physicist, is finding out what life is. Biologists are very cagey about this. When does chemistry turn into biology? Seems to be a secret the biologists don't really want to let an ordinary physicist know. So for me, I'm really happy with complex chemistry as the first steps. You're starting to cook and create the things that could eventually turn into something resembling life. Almost certainly not like life as we know it, Jim, but there you are.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I really didn't consider that. Yeah, there could be a grey area between.
Yeah.
You know, what.
It's always puzzled me.
as well.
Yeah, wow, it's a good one. I'll mention if no one else has any questions, I'll just mention a couple of things. That if you go out to see Mars at 12:30 or maybe slightly earlier here over in Norfolk, we're further east, and hopefully it clears up tonight. I saw it the other night. It's always worth looking a little bit further around to the north because there's also a comet, the bright comet Neowise, F3 Neowise, and I'm sure most of you have probably heard of it. But I think at the moment it's about on a par with the brightness with Mars itself, which is quite something. So it's ventured in on a 7,000-year orbit, I think, this thing. So another fascinating solar system object. But yeah, other than that, without further ado, unless Andy wants to mention anything else, do you, treasurer, business?
No, I'm all good, thank you. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, wholehearted congratulations for achieving all what you have, David. It's fantastic. And even though you've lived through some failures, you've lived through some stonking successes as well, haven't you? So, really shown it all tonight. I mean, you've had quite some life going through all of that, ups and downs. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you all because you're all taxpayers, I'm sure. And an awful lot of it has been done with taxpayers' money. I'm deeply grateful. I've been lucky, but anyhow, I'm really happy to share it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fabulous.
All the best then. Yeah. We'll give you a round of applause as everybody. All we can do on Zoom, isn't it? Yeah. Quite the same.
Okay. Well, I promise to come and visit you in the flesh sometime when we're able to. I can talk about something else then.
I'm sure you've got lots to talk about. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend.
Okay. Bye.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.